in the DeSoto for a long time, probably over a year. The car will not start. So in this video I'll be discussing the basis of no start of a classic car, as well as the solutions for it. So classic cars, it's a whole different story with the new car. The modern car could be the computer. The computer could cause no start, a bunch of sensors, a bunch of odd things, wires, things that you cannot test, or a combination of them. It's a whole different story, and it's a goddamn nightmare. Cars such as this 1947 DeSoto, there are only three things that the car needs to run: fuel, air, and spark. Right? And you could say compression as well, but that would sort of fall into air category. But okay, let's say four. So fuel, air, spark, and compression. So basically, a car obviously needs fuel, and if it doesn't have air mixed in with the fuel can't explode. And then it needs the spark to ignite that fuel-air mixture. And finally, it needs compression in order to suck the fuel from the carburetor. Back when I started, I thought that I picked up a carburetor and I looked at it and tried to find battery. I sort of thought that fuel was injected by the carburetor through electricity or something like that. But no, the carburetor is purely mechanical. It does not have any movement of its own, if you will. The engine itself sucks the gasoline that's in the carburetor. That's why you need compression. So if any one of those things is off, the car will either not work or it will work very poorly. So in my case, the first thing I like to do is determine if we have electricity. So I inspect the wires. I just look to see if the wires are good, if the battery's charged. That's it. And if you can, what you can do as well, you can remove one of the spark plugs and crank the engine. So if it's not cranking, then that's the starter or the battery. That's the only two things that could possibly cause a car not to crank, unless the whole engine is bad or the transmission is in gear for some reason. But apart from those very tragic problems, the car will crank as long as you've got a starter and a good battery. So if it's not cranking, those are the only two possible culprits. Once again, assuming that there's no mechanical interferences with the engine. So we're past that. The car cranks just fine. In this case, particular case in DeSoto, I'll open a bit of a parallel line here. I've got a 12-volt battery going to a 6-volt starter, and this 6-volt starter used to be a foot-activated starter, so it doesn't have a solenoid on it. You'd have to manually, well, using your foot mechanically, push the starter to engage the engine, which to me is beautiful. Unfortunately, the actual foot linkage is missing, so I actually have to engage it by hand, and then through the front here, I just touch the wire on the relay here to cause it to crank. So that's one thing that's going on, but it cranks just fine, and there's no real problem in putting 12 volts to a 6-volt starter, as long as you don't leave it on for very long. 6-volt wires are actually thicker and more heavy duty than 12-volt wires. that's a whole different discussion. So after that, as long as the engine is cranking, then we fall back into those three things. Compression. So we start with compression. What I like to do is, while the engine is cranking, I just put my hand here over the carburetor, or I can just listen to it, and if I can feel suction, vacuum, then that means we have vacuum. Alright? So in my case here, we're past that. We have good vacuum. We have good oil in the engine as well. The engine was in good shape. So I know I have vacuum. So second thing, I know I have electricity. Previously, the spark plugs are all new. The distributor was fine. And if I can check the spark in a few different ways. I can remove one of the spark plugs or one of the spark plug wires and listen and see if there's actual spark. The other way is you can remove the distributor cap and just press on the spring on the contact points and just open and close it. And if there's spark, then you have spark. So once again, one possible scenario would be that we don't have spark in the spark plug. So we go back, we follow backwards then. We check if there's spark on the distributor. So we have spark on the distributor and no spark in the spark plugs. And either the spark plugs or the wires themselves are bad. It's that simple. You're just following the steps and eliminating sources of the problem. If the distributor doesn't have any spark, then it has to be either the distributor is wrongly adjusted or broken, which is that once again very tragic, very rare. In most cases, it's the ignition coil, a little round transformer, which only costs about $10, so it's worth having them, at least two of them around. You can just test them. Right? In my case, all that is working, and you can, at this point, you can also simplify things and make things a lot faster by listening to the car. There's this different sound as to when it's just cranking and when it's actually trying to start. So if it's just cranking, it's just going yeah, that's just cranking sort of thing. When it's actually trying to start, they go it's a different sound. So if you hear that sound, that means you have spark. Maybe not sufficient spark. That's the worst kind of problem because it's harder to identify. But that means you have spark. In my case, I have spark. I have compression. There's nothing obstructing the air going into the engine to have the filter cover off. Sometimes there's like if you're working, you get a really old car. It's been sitting a long time. Then you have a rat's nest or paper or plastic bags, and they're impeding the flow of air into the engine. Or sometimes you have too much fuel and not enough air. It's called flooding, engine flooding, which I did have that problem with this car at one point. But that's been a while. The engine oil has been changed, so that's not the problem. So we have air, I have spark, I have compression. That leaves me with only one problem, which is fuel. So somehow fuel is not getting to the engine. How do I determine if that is indeed the problem? Well, if everything else is fine, I can bypass the carburetor and do the carburation myself. Basically, you get yourself a little squirt gun, or if you have a spray gun. Another day I use the spray gun, like for painting. You put gasoline in it and spray. The only thing the carburetor does is convert liquid gasoline to spray. That's all it does. Spray burns much better, and it mixes in with the air. If you literally, if you just have gasoline in the engine, it will not burn and it will not explode. So my grandfather used to do an interesting experiment, was to fill up a Coke bottle, like a 2-liter Coke bottle, to the brim with gasoline, then he'd get a match and he'd ask us, well, what you think's gonna happen? And of course most people go, oh, it's gonna explode, stay away, don't do that. It will not explode. The gasoline will catch fire only at the very top, because that's the only place where there is air. That's the only place where the gasoline is mixing in with the air. The dangerous thing is if the gasoline bottle is almost empty, then it will explode, because there's a lot of air and it's a lot of surface area being mixed with the fuel. So once again, if you don't have air, you can't make anything explode. You can have dynamite, you can have nitroglycerin. It will not explode if you do not have air with it. Nuclear bomb, that's another thing. But so I literally get a squirt gun like this. This happens to be the zinc additive or the break-in oil additive that I used, and I just pour a little bit of it into the carburetor, and then I listen. And if the engine tries to start, that should indicate to me that we don't have fuel getting to the carburetor. And from there's only two possible things that could stop fuel from getting to the carburetor. On these cars, the fuel pump is mechanical. There's no electricity. It's actually connected to the engine. The engine moves the pump. So as long as the engine is cranking, it should be pumping fuel. So if fuel is not getting to the carburetor, once again, fuel could possibly not be getting past the carburetor because it's clogged, or it's it's full of dirt or something, or it's seized up. That could be a problem. One of the possible problems. If the carburetor is good, then it could either be the fuel pump, or in most cases, the leak in the line. So the fuel pump operates, mechanical fuel pump operates through vacuum. So just as the engine sucks gasoline, it actually the fuel pump also sucks gasoline. So if there's a leak somewhere along the line, then it's not being able to suck that gasoline, right? And it doesn't have to be a huge leak. Just a small leak will stop it from being able to suck in the gasoline. But let's start with the most obvious. Let's see if the carburetor, if I squirt gasoline into the engine, if it tries to start. I've done it and it should try to start. So it's just a little bit, just a little squirt. It will not start if I don't have the ignition on. You see the engine cranks just fine. I have the ignition on. See, as you can hear, it tries to start. So I know that the fuel, everything else is fine. If I were to get somebody to just keep squirting a little bit of gasoline in there, the engine would run. So the second thing that I do is disconnect the fuel line, plug to the carburetor, and see if there's fuel at the carburetor. And in my case, I found the problem. I don't have fuel. The carburetor is empty, and the fuel pump is not pumping gasoline. So I'll zoom in there. As you can see, the fuel line is disconnected and it's dry. When I crank the engine, that should be pouring gasoline. See, there's no gasoline coming out of the pipe. So I'm going to try dumping in some gasoline. By the way, the starter is it's fine, but because I'm trying to engage it by hand, and I think this isn't really the correct starter for this car. Sometimes I can't really engage it properly. So another problem. But I'm going to try dumping some gasoline to the fuel pump. And because there's air in the fuel pump, and it might not pump at all. It has to be wet. Also going to try to dump some fuel into the carburetor. And at this point, I know that the fuel pump is not doing its job. I'm not getting fuel into the carburetor. If I can fill it there. I'm just going to quickly try to get a brass fitting to connect it as an L so I can put fuel in there. Has a diaphragm inside it, which is just the rubber membrane that goes like this, pumps the fuel. And of course, this car is 7 years old, plus the ethanol on the gasoline might have destroyed that rubber. But great grandfather used to have that problem too in his cars, and instead of fixing it, you just buy a bottle of Coke, get his grandchildren to drink it, and pour gasoline inside it, then get somebody to hold it out of the window. So it would be the fuel would be gravity fed. This is sort of what I'm doing now. Just gotta find my fitting here. get back to part 2.